For 30 years, almost every telegram that ordinary Americans sent overseas, and almost every one they received from abroad, was quietly handed to the government. Not under a warrant, not because a judge had signed anything, not because a law allowed it. The biggest telegraph companies in the country simply made copies of their international traffic and gave those copies to American intelligence, day after day, year after year, while the public knew nothing about it. At its peak, the program was processing on the order of 150,000 messages a month. It was called Project SHAMROCK, and unlike most of the files in this series, it is not a story about spying on a foreign enemy. It is a story about a government turning its most powerful listening tools inward onto its own citizens, and about the rare moment when that machine was finally dragged into the daylight. And here's the thing that makes Shamrock different to tell. We do not know about it because of a leak or a defector. We know about it because of an investigation, a congressional inquiry that pried the program open and put it on the public record. The declassified history of that investigation, written by people who were in the room, along with the official committee reports, is where this story comes from. For once, the document at the center of the file is not a spy's confession. It is the record of the watchers being watched. To understand how this began, you have to go back to the Second World War, to a country fighting for its life and willing to bend the rules to do it. In 1939, as war broke out in Europe, American military intelligence went to the great international telegraph carriers, the companies whose cables and wireless links carried messages in and out of the United States, and asked for access. They wanted to read the coded traffic of foreign powers moving across those wires. The companies agreed. It was wartime, the enemy was real, and reading the cables was a weapon. For the duration of the war, the carriers let the government see their international traffic. Wars end. Surveillance programs, it turns out, often do not. When the fighting stopped in 1945, military intelligence went back to those same companies and asked them to keep the arrangement going into peacetime. And again, they agreed. There was no longer a declared war to justify it, no foreign army to fight, but the flow of copies continued, now aimed at a new adversary as the Cold War took shape. The companies that kept the secret were the giants of the industry, the ones that carried the bulk of America's international messages, and through them, the government had a standing tap on a huge share of everything the country wired to the rest of the world. When the National Security Agency was created in the early 1950s as America's central code-breaking and signals organization, it inherited this arrangement, and the collection went on under its roof. The mechanics were almost mundane in their efficiency. The companies turned over copies of their international telegrams, in the later years on magnetic tape, and analysts went through them, looking for items of intelligence interest. Think about the breadth of that for a moment. A telegram in those decades was how you reached someone far away when it mattered. A death in the family, a business deal, a message to a relative in the old country, a negotiation, a love letter, a lawyer's instruction. All of it international, all of it private, and a copy of nearly all of it flowing into a government building with no warrant attached to any of it. It is worth naming the companies because their cooperation is the spine of the whole thing. The carriers that fed the program were the dominant names in international communications of that era, the firms whose lines and wireless circuits handled the overwhelming majority of America's overseas cables. Each business day, copies of their international traffic, the so-called drop copies, made their way to the agency. In the early decades, that meant physical paper and microfilm, couriered or collected. In the later years, it became reels of magnetic tape. The point is that this was not an occasional dip into the stream. It was a standing pipe, an entire industry's worth of international telegrams routed, in copy, into a government that the senders never imagined was reading. And it endured across changes of administration and changes of technology, a fixture so embedded that the people running it could barely remember a time before it existed. For most of its life, the people sending those messages had no way of knowing, and the small number of officials and executives who did know kept it to themselves. There was, remarkably, almost no paper holding it together. When investigators later went looking for the agreement that authorized all this, the contract or the order that set out the terms, they could barely find anything. The companies struggled to produce even a witness who remembered how the deal had been struck. It had begun as a wartime handshake and simply continued. A 30-year practice resting on almost nothing written down, carried forward by institutional habit long after the war that started it had passed into history. And then the program took a darker turn, because a tool that can copy everything is a tool that can be aimed. Alongside the bulk collection of telegrams ran a second effort, a watch list. Intelligence agencies compiled lists of names, and the traffic was searched for messages to and from those people. In principle, a watch list might target foreign agents. In practice, the names that ended up on these lists during the 1960s and early 1970s included Americans whose offense was political. Critics of the Vietnam War, civil rights leaders, people active in the protest movements of the era. The communications of American citizens, swept up because of what they believed and said, were pulled from the flow and passed around the intelligence community. The machine built to watch foreign enemies was being turned on Americans for their politics, and among the names caught up in this kind of watch listing were some of the most prominent figures of the civil rights and anti-war movements of the time. It is worth being precise about how that worked, because the mechanism is the abuse. A name went onto a watch list, and from then on, the river of intercepted traffic was searched for anything to or from that name, which was then pulled out and circulated. There did not need to be a crime. There did not need to be evidence of espionage. A person could land on a list because an agency had decided their politics were worth monitoring, and the standing collection did the rest. When a parallel congressional inquiry, a House subcommittee, pressed the telegraph companies a little later, one of the carriers produced an actual list of the government's targets from the late 1960s. A concrete artifact of who the watching had been aimed at. The lists were not abstract. They were names, real people, many of them guilty of nothing but dissent. This is the point where Shamrock stops being a quirky relic of wartime improvisation and becomes something more serious, a genuine abuse, the secret surveillance of citizens by their own government with no legal authority and no oversight. For years, it stayed buried. The companies kept their secret. The agency kept its secret. The arrangement was so far outside the law that there was no judge to appeal to because no judge had ever been told it existed. What finally broke it open was a change in the national mood. By the mid-1970s, the country had been through the trauma of Vietnam and the scandal of Watergate, and the old assumption that the intelligence agencies should simply be trusted to police themselves had collapsed. In 1975, the Senate created a special committee to investigate the intelligence community, chaired by a senator named Frank Church. The Church Committee, as it became known, went digging into the secret history of American intelligence, and what it found shocked even seasoned Washington. Assassination plots, mail opening, spying on Americans, and, among the discoveries, Project Shamrock, the decades-long handover of the nation's international telegrams. The investigators who worked the Shamrock thread later described how strange and difficult it was to pin down, precisely because so little had been written and so few people would talk. They sought documents from the telegraph companies and found almost nothing. They sought witnesses and found a handful of executives who had only partial knowledge. The thing had been hidden not behind an elaborate cover story, but behind sheer informality, a secret kept by being barely documented at all. At one point, a low-level employee inside the agency stumbled onto an old file relating to the program, and it proved to be, in the investigators' words, a Mother Lode, internal memos describing the original wartime visits to the companies, the paper trail that the institutions themselves had seemingly forgotten they possessed. As the committee moved to bring this into the open, the executive branch fought back. When the time came for the telegraph company executives to testify in public, the administration tried to stop it, arguing that the whole matter was too sensitive for daylight. The committee pressed ahead anyway. On a day in November of 1975, with the witness table sitting empty because the executive branch had refused to send anyone, the chairman read the names of the companies and the outline of the program into the public record of the United States Senate. After 30 years, Project Shamrock had a name the public could see. The director of the National Security Agency, facing the coming exposure, had already moved to shut the program down. He ended it in the spring of 1975 on his own authority before the hearings fully broke. And when the committee delivered its judgment, it did not mince words. The chairman concluded that Shamrock was probably the largest governmental interception program affecting Americans ever undertaken. Not one of several, the largest. A program that had silently read the country's international mail by the hundreds of thousands of messages a month for a generation. But the most important thing about the Church Committee is not the outrage, it is what came next. Because this is one of the rare files in this whole series where the discovery of an abuse actually led to a durable fix. The investigation made it undeniable that the intelligence agencies had been operating in a legal vacuum, doing things to Americans that no law clearly permitted and no court reviewed. So the country did something about it. In 1978, Congress passed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the law usually called FISA. For the first time, it drew explicit lines around what the government could and could not do when it wanted to intercept communications for intelligence purposes on American soil. It outlawed exactly the kind of wholesale, warrantless gathering of telegrams that SHAMROCK had been. It outlawed the arbitrary compiling of watch lists of Americans, and it created a special court whose job was to stand between the agencies and the citizen, to require that surveillance touching Americans be justified to a judge. That is the turn that makes SHAMROCK, in the end, a story about accountability rather than just abuse. For 30 years, a secret program read Americans' private messages with no law behind it. When it was finally exposed, the response was not a shrug. It was an investigation that named it in public, a shutdown, and a new statute and a new court built specifically to keep it from happening again in that form. The watchers were watched, and the watching changed the rules. I want to be careful not to wrap this up too neatly, though, because the honest version of the story has a longer shadow. The framework built after SHAMROCK did not end the hard questions about surveillance. It set boundaries, and then, in the decades that followed, technology and new fears pressed against those boundaries again and again. The basic tension at the heart of SHAMROCK between a government's desire to collect everything in the name of security and a citizen's expectation that private communication stays private did not get solved in 1978. It got a referee and a rule book. The argument itself has never really stopped, and anyone who has paid attention to the debates over surveillance in our own century will recognize the shape of it, because the question SHAMROCK raised about bulk collection and warrantless access and the watching of citizens are questions we are still arguing about today. There is a principle buried in all of this that is easy to miss and worth saying out loud. The deepest problem with SHAMROCK was not that the government read some particular guilty person's telegram. It was that it copied everyone's, the innocent along with whatever handful of genuine targets might be in the flow, and sorted out the meaning later. That is the quiet danger of bulk collection. It does not begin by accusing you of anything. It simply gathers everything, on the theory that the haystack might somewhere contain a needle, and trusts the people holding the haystack to behave. The whole architecture of suspicion is inverted. Instead of the government showing a court why it should be allowed to watch a specific person, it watches everyone first and explains nothing, because no one outside the secret even knows to ask. What the post-SHAMROCK reforms tried to restore was the older order. The idea that surveillance touching citizens should start with a reason and a warrant, not with a standing copy of the nation's mail. Whether that principle is held up under the pressures of the decades since is a question worth keeping alive, and it is one this channel will come back to. That is exactly why this file matters. SHAMROCK is the origin story of modern surveillance law in America, the case that proved the machine could be turned inward, and the moment the country decided that turning it inward would, at least, require rules. The records are open now. You can read the committee's findings and the first-hand accounts of the investigators who pulled the secret apart, and see for yourself how a 30-year program built on a wartime handshake was finally brought into the light, and what the country chose to do once it could see. Read it yourself in the links below. The next file is already on the table.